You might recall back in May, Trump seized upon an outrageous conspiracy theory percolating in far-right circles, a theory based upon an extreme mischaracterization of the FBI search warrant of Mar-a-Lago. Trump claimed in a fundraising email that President Biden and the FBI were, quote, locked and loaded to take me out during the 2022 search of Mar-a-Lago. He later posted that Biden, quote, authorized the FBI to use deadly lethal force. But what Trump tried to portray as an attempt on his life, really just a distortion of the standard boilerplate language that accompanies every FBI search. His false narrative was based entirely on this, the FBI's policy on the use of force. Basically, it says that agents can respond with deadly force only when their lives are in imminent danger. So that language, not unique to the search of Mar-a-Lago. In fact, it was the very same policy that the FBI used in their search of President Biden's home as well. If anything, throughout the process of recovering those documents from Mar-a-Lago, Trump got an unusual amount of leniency, including the fact that the FBI notified the Secret Service before executing the warrant. Oh, one other thing. Trump and his family, they weren't even at Mar-a-Lago while that search took place. But none of those inconvenient facts stopped Trump's allies from amplifying his lie.
They're saying Trump's going to unleash assassination squads on his enemies, but Biden unleashed armed agents into Trump's house, authorizing them to use deadly force.
Right.
Maybe they were looking for a little action.
Maybe.
Something actually could have gone down, I guess, at Mar-a-Lago, beyond just looking for the documents.
Why was Merrick Garland prepping for a possible, shootout?
Merrick Garland basically issued a kill order for President Trump.
Now, for Jack Smith, all of that was obviously real cause for concern. And in a recent filing, he urged Judge Cannon to impose a narrow modification to the terms of Trump's release to limit what he can say. Smith wrote that Trump is left to argue that the First Amendment will be eroded unless he is permitted to lie about FBI agents intending to murder him and his family. The law requires no such thing. He then pointed to how Trump's rhetoric has led to imminent threats to law enforcement, including an example of a Trump supporter armed with an AR-15 and a nail gun attempting to attack an FBI office in Ohio 3 days after the Mar-a-Lago search took place. He pointed out that hours after Trump posted on his social media platform about the search, the supporter posted, "Kill FBI on sight." So this afternoon, Jack Smith's prosecutors made their case to Judge Cannon in Fort Pierce. They once again cited Trump's false claims that he was the target of an assassination attempt, and told the court there was no reason for such incendiary language that would invite violence as retribution from Trump supporters. In response, Judge Cannon asked, "Where do you see the call to violence?" During another exchange, Cannon grew so frustrated with the prosecution that she said, quote, "I don't like your tone." Again, she said that to a prosecutor just trying to protect law enforcement from threats of violence. And I wish I could say I'm surprised. Christy Greenberg is the former deputy chief of the criminal division in the Southern District of New York. Mary McCord is the former deputy assistant attorney general for national security at the Department of Justice. And Katie Phang is the host of the Katie Phang Show on MSNBC. She was in court today in Fort Pierce, Florida. Katie, my Florida woman, let's start with you. You were in the courthouse. Jack Smith, he was in the courthouse today. Seems like this hearing got fairly heated at certain points. Your big takeaways?
Yeah, and you're right about that. I was focusing a lot on Jack Smith because I wanted to see his expressions on his face when David Harbach, who's a part of the special counsel legal team, was having the back and forth with Judge Cannon. Judge Cannon, on previous occasions with this particular attorney, David Harbach, has had issues with him and vice versa. I don't think that she appreciates the gravity of what was being presented to her, because she immediately, not because there was a suggestion made by the other side in terms of the defense, but she immediately said, but what about the fact that redactions have been done of the names of law enforcement and other witnesses? How is that not enough for me to consider when you're making this argument, government, that there's some danger or risk to the law enforcement officers? And she really kind of hung her hat on that throughout a lot of what happened today. But the hearing is about 2 hours. Special counsel Jack Smith, poker face the entire time, even when there was a lot of the heated exchange between Judge Cannon and the attorney for the special counsel's office. But there were some really striking things that really stood out today, Alicia. One of the things was the special counsel saying, you don't need a tragedy to strike in order to get a bond modification. And the law supports that context and that idea. There was also another phrase that was used by special counsel's office. They said Trump has a peculiarly potent tool, and that's his ability to reach his followers on social media. Trump himself has acknowledged in writing and in verbal statements that he knows the power of social media for him. And that's why there was the argument from special counsel's office that you don't need something bad to happen. You don't need a link between those examples that you just read and explained to our viewers and Donald Trump to say that the causal link there creates the need. It's actually the threat of significant, imminent, foreseeable danger to these law enforcement officers. Now, Todd Blanche, on behalf of Donald Trump, did his meandering thing that he does, but he basically said, Judge, eventually maybe this will have to happen, maybe at trial when these witnesses are called, but otherwise you don't have a link and a direct connection between Trump and these incidents that have been raised as exhibits and examples in special counsel's motion. And because of that, it's a prior restraint on free speech. He's a political candidate for the office of the president, and it's on the eve of a presidential debate, and you shouldn't do it.
Mary, how would you push back against that supposed lack of connective tissue between Donald Trump's words and the threat of violence against law enforcement officials?
I think the way to push back is the way that Jack Smith and his team have done, have explained in every court where they've sought an order like this. This one is different because this is about modifying the conditions of his bail in order to restrict certain speech that causes, again, that significant and imminent foreseeable danger to law enforcement. But in every other case, including in D.C. and up in Manhattan, the prosecutors have given example after example of things that Mr. Trump says over social media or at campaign rallies and actions and threats taken by individuals out in the United States. Those might be call-in threats, threatening witnesses, threatening judges' staff, threatening prosecutors and their staffs. It might be actual efforts to commit an act of violence, like the example from right after the search of Mar-a-Lago. And, you know, there are many, many, many of these that they have to point to. So to suggest there's not a cause and effect, I think really is to ignore what several years now have shown us. I think it was reasonable for her to ask, would redactions take care of it? And what Mr. Harbach explained is, well, even with redactions, there have been leaks of the names of those agents, and those are available, you know, out there still. They can't ever be taken down once that has leaked. And I actually think the redactions have probably prevented them from being that tragedy that, you know, we don't want to have to wait for. But somebody who is determined can certainly find out the identity of these agents.
So, Christy, Katie had her eyes on Jack Smith for good reason. You had your eyes on Eileen Cannon, and you wrote on Twitter, only Judge Cannon could use a hearing about Trump's dangerous lies that the FBI was out to kill him and his family as an opportunity to scold the prosecutor and not Trump for lack of decorum.
So it makes sense to me that this prosecutor was getting fired up about this because this is a prosecutor who has worked with these agents and built this case and knows these people and knows that they're putting their lives on the line every day for us. And this idea that she would be so cavalier, I think, to the fact that there really is a threat to them. I mean, this motion by Jack Smith was filed a month ago, right? And clearly she doesn't see any imminent threat because she didn't deal with it right away. She sat on it. And while she was sitting on it, what happened? Well, there was a call-in, a threat to an FBI agent on Hunter Biden's case. And that person said, if Trump wins, you're all going to jail. And if Trump loses, you'll be slaughtered and your family will be slaughtered. Those are the kinds of threats. And this idea that Judge Cannon is saying, well, where's the cause and effect? You know, Donald Trump didn't tell that person to say this. But Donald Trump himself connects A to B, because Donald Trump has said, he said it in the CNN town hall, that they listen to me, my supporters listen to me like no one else, right? He knows the effect that he has. And we all know the effect he has, and so does Judge Cannon. So this idea that there is not an imminent threat to these agents is just frankly laughable. And the idea that she is scolding the prosecutor for getting upset about that and for trying to make his point, rather than say to a criminal defendant in a case, you can't talk about the case agents that way. You can't say these kinds of things. Any other criminal defendant, any other judge would be scolding a criminal defendant for making statements like that.
So, Katie, given that she's not exactly moving with alacrity, what comes next for this motion on the bond modification? As we count down to the first presidential debate on Thursday night, Bears repeating, none of this is normal. We have never seen a presidential debate as early in the election cycle as this one. One of the candidates is a convicted felon. And that candidate, so busy trying to reset expectations, he's accusing the current president of the United States of using performance-enhancing drugs. Now, with that disclaimer, also worth pointing out that there are definitely some trend lines moving in President Biden's favor right now. But don't take my word for it. Here's Karl Rove on Fox News over the weekend.
There's been a trend since the May 30th guilty verdict in the New York case. The movement is among independents, and they have moved in recent polls roughly 9 points towards Biden, and that's where it's coming from. And remember, 21% of independents in a survey shortly after the conviction said that they would be less likely to vote for Donald Trump as a result of the conviction.
The question now, how does Joe Biden take advantage of those trends on Thursday night? How does he make the case to millions of undecided voters watching that Donald Trump's criminality should matter to them? Biden campaign co-chair Mitch Landrieu offered this roadmap on Meet the Press just yesterday.
The fact of the matter is that the sky is blue sometimes, and Donald Trump is a convicted felon. And the American people have to sit in that for a second. The person who wants to be president has to go sit with his probation officer before he actually goes to the debate. And so it is just a fact. But it's not just to call Donald Trump a convicted felon. It goes to his behavior, and it goes to his character. Remember, he's actually filed bankruptcy 6 times. That means that he's not just a bad business guy. It means he's screwed all the small people who actually relied on him for a living. And so the American people are going to see that.
Tim Miller is a former Republican strategist and host of the Bulwark podcast. Claire McCaskill is a former Democratic senator from Missouri and co-host of the MSNBC podcast, How to Win 2024. Both are MSNBC contributors, and both of them are going to be in Atlanta for the debate this week. Senator McCaskill, I want you to pick up where Mitch Landrieu left off, this question of Donald Trump's criminality, because there's some hand-wringing about whether or not President Biden was going to go after former President Trump on this question. We've now seen the Biden campaign actually release an ad that goes squarely after him on this topic. Do you think he goes after him on Thursday night?
Well, I think he'll go after him. I don't know how important it is to remind everyone that Donald Trump is a felon. I think everybody in America knows he's been convicted. And the problem is there's this little calcified group of people that are believing what Trump is saying, that somehow this is not a valid conviction. I think it's more important for Joe Biden to go after Donald Trump, literally hammer and tongs. He needs to be the State of the Union, Joe Biden. He needs, I mean, what a gift he's been given, Alicia. Think about it. Donald Trump has spent the last 6 months telling everybody that Joe Biden can't walk or talk. Mm-hmm. So all Joe Biden has to do is show scrappy Joe Biden from Scranton. He doesn't respect Trump. He knows Trump lies all the time. He needs to say, shut up, man, and stop your yapping, and do all of those things to put Trump in his place and stand up to him. This is about Biden showing strength, not so much what he says.
It's funny, Tim, the senator used the term junkyard dog with me over the weekend, which I think really does sum up the President Biden we may see. At the same time that you have Joe Biden actually preparing for this debate, you have reports that Trump is not doing mock debates with anyone standing in for Biden. Instead, he is meeting with Senators J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Eric Schmidt. Wonder what that tells you about the performance he's planning to put on Thursday.
Well, I don't. Can you even believe what comes out of the Trump world,
Fair enough.
Alicia? You know what I mean? And so I take all of those reports of what's happening in Trump world with a grain of salt. But I do think that what we can see publicly is that Donald Trump is concerned about how this debate is being framed up as you lead into the debate. That is why he's doing all of the weird stuff about Joe Biden being on drugs. It's worth reminding everybody that he tried this exact same playbook in 2020 and in a losing debate. You just don't remember that because, time is a flat circle. These news cycles flash away. But he already tried this Joe Biden is on drugs thing. It didn't work then because Joe Biden's a teetotaler, and it's absurd. And you also see it with him. There was the example over the weekend where he started to say that it wasn't true that he called called the troop suckers and losers. To me, that also shows that he's a little bit worried about the debate. He's thinking about what Joe Biden's attacks might be on him, and he's trying to take the air out of the balloon ahead of time. So I think there's a lot of evidence that Trump feels is concerned about the debate. How that manifests in his weird mind and whether he's prepping or not, I'm not sure, but I think we can see plainly that he's concerned.
Claire, I think we all accept that there is an asymmetry here in terms of the fact that we expect President Biden to actually talk about policy, to talk about his record, to talk about the things that he would want to do in a second term. We don't necessarily expect that of former President Trump. Over the weekend, I don't know if you caught this, I was able to speak with Kevin Roberts, head of the Heritage Foundation, asked him about Project 2025, basically said it was about extending Trumpism. Just to remind everyone, I know you two don't need the reminder, Project 2025, a blueprint to disassemble the administrative state, implement a Christian nationalist agenda. How does President Biden take that and pin that on Donald Trump?
Well, I think he can do it pretty simply. I mean, this campaign for Biden is all about contrast. It's competence versus chaos. It's darkness versus light. It is a felonious philanderer versus a family man. It is job creation versus saying that America sucks. I mean, this really is such a contrast, and Biden just has to keep drawing that contrast. It is protecting women's freedoms versus bragging about bringing down Roe v. Wade. There are so many things where Biden can just quickly pivot to the contrast, and it is going to be very hard for Trump to do anything but blather and lie. And as we've seen when he's debated before, he doesn't do well when he's called to task. And if the mics are not on when it's not his turn to talk, I think this could go very badly for Donald Trump. We'll see. Frankly, I'm not sure it's going to make a huge amount of difference either way how this debate goes, except I do believe that these independent voters, as they watch Donald Trump more and more on media, they're seeing how unhinged he's become with electric boats and weird stuff. I mean, he's saying really weird stuff now. I mean, stuff that makes no sense.
On January 20th, 2017, General Mike Flynn began his post as Donald Trump's national security advisor under a cloud of suspicion stemming from his contacts with then Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. Within a day, the FBI was questioning Flynn about those contacts. Within a month, Flynn was out of a job after it became clear that he misled the Trump administration about them. Since that time, Flynn has rebranded as something of a hero on the fringe of the far right, headlining events across the country and paying lip service to all kinds of ridiculous QAnon-adjacent conspiracy theories. As an excellent new piece by David Fahrenthold in the New York Times reports, that rebrand has proven very lucrative to Flynn and his family. Quote, a New York Times investigation found Flynn family members had made at least $2.2 million monetizing Michael Flynn's right-wing stardom in recent years, with more than half of that going to Flynn directly. And the report indicates that number is certainly an underestimate of the cash Flynn has brought in on the grift circuit, including $60 grand a year for what was effectively a no-show job as the chairman of a conservative charity. Now, Mike Flynn is hardly the first member of Trump's inner circle to use notoriety as a launch pad to the world of right-wing grifting. Rudy Giuliani, the bankrupt, twice indicted former mayor of New York City, recently got in the game.
You all know I stand by the truth, and if I put my name on something, I truly believe in it. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to something I'm incredibly proud of. My own brand of organic specialty coffee, Rudy Coffee. Believe me when I say it's the best coffee you'll ever try.
Because we can all sell Bibles. The best coffee you will ever try. There's also Mike Lindell, one of the top promoters of Donald Trump's big lie of a stolen election. Made his name selling pillows, which a top Amazon review calls, quote, super lumpy. But of course, all these grifters were simply learning from the best. Donald Trump's entire career has been one long grift. We could dedicate an entire hour to his schemes, from his many instances of civil business fraud to his bogus Trump University, to Trump steaks, Trump wine, Trump vodka, the perfume, you get the idea. His post-presidential grifts, like his own personal brand of digital trading cards, and of course, those shiny gold sneakers.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more, September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.